Hi, welcome to Rock and Metal Invasion. My name is Steve. Coming up on the show today, I'm doing Warrant 96, Belly to Belly, Volume 1, and other albums that have no Volume 2 or Part 2. So, originally, I wasn't going to focus on this album. I was just going to mention this as an example of an album in my collection that has no Volume 2. But then I played it tonight, and I forgot just how much I like this album. So that's probably going to surprise some people. So while you're digesting that, let's talk about some other things. So one thing that's interesting is the band is Warrant, but they're actually called Warrant 96. Why 96? I don't know, but what I'm thinking is perhaps it's one of those situations where they really wanted to differentiate the Warrant in 1996 from the Cherry Pie Warrant. So maybe that has something to do with it, because it is different. It's different sound, but it's three of the members from the band, and three of them sort of featured members of the band that had recorded Cherry Pie, with Jani Lane on vocals, a big part of that. I mean, he is a big part of Warrant. At least at this stage, he's the main songwriter. So this was actually released on CMC, which was a label that in the mid-90s was kind of, I mean, this label's given a bit of a hard time. It's sort of like where hair metal bands sort of went to die or retire or put out their last sort of albums before, they were forgotten about. But actually, they had some pretty big bands. They had Judas Priest on their label, Slaughter, Saigon Kick, even Loverboy. So they had some big names. Granted, all those bands in the 90s, mid-90s especially, were struggling. And so here was a label that was willing to give them a home and put out their albums. So, that's just how it works out, I guess. This album was actually produced by the band. So no Boho on this one, who had produced their previous album. Another interesting thing that I just noticed today, the back cover. Now, there's no vinyl for this, so I put it on CD. Back cover has no song titles on it, so you can't see the song titles. And I think that can sometimes be a bit off-putting for people as well. Obviously, there are song titles, and you can see the song titles when you open up and look at the CD. Now, supposedly this is a concept album, and yeah, of course, it's called Belly to Belly Volume 1, which gives you the indication that there's going to be further volumes. Of course, that's what this episode's about today. Albums that are given the title Volume 1, and then there is no Volume 2. But yeah, it's supposed to be a concept album that is supposedly following the Rags to Riches storyline concerning fame, fortune, and a sort of examination of one's value system once the spotlight fades, which I guess to some degree you would say is happening with Warrant. I mean, they were big. They had a platinum album with Cherry Pie, and their debut album as well. We're not talking sort of Bon Jovi, Def Leppard kind of level success, but quite popular, well known. Also, I suppose one of those bands too where their big hit song was great, but also bad in other ways as well, right? Especially when hair metal was looked upon, that sort of sound, that the bands from that time were looked upon not so positively. Once grunge came in, that was often given the example of why that kind of music is silly and not worth worrying about anymore. So yeah, they definitely changed their sound on this album. Well, in fact, they'd already started to do that. I mean, this this is their fourth album. This is their fifth album, and the change had really started to happen. Well, definitely on their third album, then even more so on the album prior to this, Ultraphobic, which Boho produced, and then even progressed more into that more sort of alternative rock kind of sound on this this album. And I guess that makes sense. They're trying to still fit in with the times. But I would like to point out that I don't believe it's a grunge album. There are some fantastic songs on this album. For me, the standout tracks are Feels Good, Letter to a Friend, and Falling Down. But I mean, just playing this album tonight, there are so many other really good songs on here. So if you haven't checked it out, or you haven't checked it out for a while, revisit it, because I think it's underrated. In fact, it's not rated at all. Often people really quite dismissive of this album, even people who like the band, but this album's like, no way. But for me, I really like it, and I know that that's not the common view. This is actually the last studio album to feature Jani Lane, not counting the covers album that they put out. And like I said, I think it definitely is given the grunge label, but I would probably say it's more heavy alternative rock. It obviously quite different to their Cherry Pie album, but the songwriting talents of Jani Lane still exist, right? They didn't disappear when hair metal disappeared, and there are some great songs on here. The first single was AYM, Angry Young Man, and this is a good example of how I don't really think they're following the grunge scene, because this song is actually like a tongue-in-cheek sort of satirical look at the whole alternative thing, right? So they're not really like joining the club. They're almost making fun of it a little bit with that song. And the song Feels Good, which is one of my favorite songs on the album. It's actually about feeling really good. It's not a negative song at all. Now, there are some negative songs on here. There are some, slightly depressing songs. Falling Down is probably a really good example of that, which is a great song. And, you listen to those lyrics and you kind of go, I think this is probably maybe written about, Jani's writing it about his own personal battles, even though, of course, it's a concept album, so it's not necessarily about him. But it very much sounds like something lyrically about maybe some of the things that he's been dealing with. Now, as you may know, if you watch my channel and watch my videos, I'm not a big fan of ballads, but one thing I noticed about Warrant, especially from their second album, they started to write some really great ballads, or Jani Lane did, as the main songwriter. Really did. I think they have a pretty good collection of ballads, because like I say, usually ballads are not tracks I sort of, dwell on too much, may even skip them sometimes, but not for Warrant, especially from album number 2. I mean, not all of them, but a good percentage of them I really like. And on this album, Room with a View would be one of my standout ballads. Great song. Check that one out. Now, here's the thing. Where do I rank this album? Well, believe it or not, I actually rank this album as my second favorite Warrant album. I know that's going to surprise some people. What's my number 1 Warrant album? Well, actually, it's the one before this one, Ultraphobic. So I like this one just a little bit more. It's close, but just like this one just a little bit more. So, not the common opinion at all. I don't know of anyone who calls this their favorite album and calls this their second favorite album and says it's close between first and second. But there we go. That's me. I'm sure right now Dan from Off the Charts, who is not a big fan of the mid-90s, is probably choking on his drink after that statement, but it's okay, Dan. We can't agree on everything, eh? And maybe you just missed this one. So if you did, check it out. If you did check it out and you don't like it, that's cool. But for me, it's their 2 best albums. I think part of it too for me was I remember, and this is exactly what a lot of people do say that are into 80s rock, hard rock, metal, that in the 90s there wasn't actually a lot of decent music even coming out, or music that they were interested in. And I found the same thing. There wasn't a lot of metal, there wasn't a lot of hard rock. So when an album like this came out, I was like, well, there's not a lot else coming out at the moment. So I gave it a really good spin, gave it lots of listens, and it is one of those albums that grows on you, as often good albums will. The more you listen to it, the more you get out of it. So I think that helped me as far as liking the album. Now, I will admit as well, like I said, I wasn't even planning on focusing too much on this album, but gave it a spin tonight and thought, actually, this is such a good album. I'm going to actually do a little bit more of a chat about this one. So really the final Warrant album with Jani Lane. Like I said, there was a covers album after this, but really this is the final one. The album before this, Ultraphobic, there's only a year gap between this, and they do sound fairly similar. So as you'd expect when there's only a year gap in between them, similar, but definitely the production is more polished. Definitely more polished on this one. But that doesn't necessarily make this bad, if you know what I'm saying, right? So it's a bit more raw, a bit more, yeah. So I kind of like both production-wise. I think they work really good. Yeah. So, but yeah, I'm a big fan of Boho. I don't understand why that guy in the 90s, no one wanted to work with him. When I think, why couldn't he have been your producer? Maybe it's just, his name was associated with so many of those hair bands, but nothing wrong with his production skills. And everything sounds really good on this album. So why no Volume 2? So this was put out as Volume 1. It's a concept album. Maybe the story is going to carry on in Volume 2. I'm guessing that's the plan. That usually is. It's quite brave, I always think, for a band to put out an album and call it the title, after the title have Volume 1, because you're really sort of expecting that there's going to be a Volume 2 and you're going to put that out. Of course, sometimes it doesn't happen, and we can talk about, I guess some reasons why. Well, things aren't successful, right? So if you put Volume 1 after your album title and it's critically dismissed, or it doesn't sell, then you're probably less likely to want to follow through maybe on a Volume 2, unless you've already recorded it. So obviously this wasn't a big hit. It wasn't a big seller. So perhaps that had something to do with it. Of course, Jani has his struggles. He's sort of out of the band in a few years anyway. And so I guess a combination of all those things probably had a lot to do with this being Volume 1 and the end of Belly to Belly, and there not being a Volume 2. Just before we finish up and move on, because I do actually have some other albums in my collection that have the title Volume 1, and then there's been no Volume 2. Just before I finish, so talk about some of the other Warrant albums, because I know I've probably surprised a few people with my numbers 1 and 2, two favorite Warrant albums. Prior to Ultraphobic, of course, there was Dog Eat Dog. This was a quality album. This is pretty good. This one came out around 92, I think. And, it's the follow-up to Cherry Pie, which had been a huge hit. So they're still on a major label here, but, grunge is starting to become very popular, and those kind of bands are getting less of a push. I like that. I like Dog Eat Dog. A lot of people do. Now, that's not an album that's critically dismissed. A lot of people do quite like it. And it's kind of that. It's kind of a mix of sort of where they were and where they're kind of going to with their sound. I think it is actually sort of somewhere in between. So yeah, and I like it. But I also like Cherry Pie. I don't even mind the title song. I think it's fun for what it is. But you can tell that Jani Lane is a great songwriter, or very good songwriter, when you hear a song like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which originally was going to be the first single. That's a brilliant song, really good. I can understand too. The record company probably it's not a hit. It doesn't seem like a hit, but it's a quality song. And again, talking about the ballads, I Saw Red, very good ballad on this album. It's still got your sort of your 80s sort of hair metal type songs like Mr. Rainmaker, Song and Dance Man, but I like those songs. yeah, there's some tracks I'm not that fussed about. So, you know, it's a big, though, for me, it is a big improvement over their debut album. Now, this you might think would be one of those albums I like, or really love even. It is sort of, was a biggish sort of a hit, mainly because of the song Heaven, which is a ballad, and actually, ironically enough, not a song I like. But yeah, this album, when it came out, I was expecting a lot more. I knew that they had been quite successful, charting, in the States and, in other countries. But when this came out and when I got it, they were, sort of doing very well. But it just never clicked with me. It's yeah, just a bit too, maybe not heavy enough, but too soft. I don't know. I think Riding High is probably the one song on here I don't mind. I don't mind the rest. It's catchy, yeah, but catchy doesn't necessarily make it something I like. So yeah, really wasn't ever that fussed about that album. So that's my least favorite. The Debu's my least favorite. And yeah, Cherry Pie and Dog Eat Dog are pretty similar. Probably give the edge to Dog Eat Dog just album quality wise, I think overall. But Cherry Pie has some standout songs on it. So there we go. So that's Warrant. Let's move on now. Just quickly before I finish up, some other examples of albums in my collection where the title is Volume 1, and then there's not, or Part 1, and there's been no follow-up. I thought this was an interesting example. Now, it's not a studio album specifically, but it's Van Halen, and it's called Best of Volume 1. So I remember when this came out, and I thought this is interesting, calling it Volume 1, especially this, I think this came out about 96. I was thinking, they're a bit hopeful, aren't they, if they're going to sort of expect to have, another Best of Volume 2 at this stage, because, I don't know, it seemed like Van Halen were kind of winding down a little bit, or was sort of slowing down, and maybe weren't really going to qualify for another Best of, which is kind of what ended up happening, right? Because they only really put out 2 more albums. Dave Comes Back, which is, what made this album a big deal. And they're good songs. I like the 2 songs that, Dave Comes Back for and does on this album. They're good. But, yeah, I just thought interesting that they called it Volume 1. And I suppose the plan was at some point there's going to be a Volume 2. And I mean, Van Halen is such a great band, so many albums. You could still do a Volume 2. It's Best of, right? So you could still do a Best of Volume 2 and just choose some other songs from the other albums. But for whatever reason, they've not done that. Of course, this is the Best of Both Worlds. Came out another compilation that came out later on, which had Dave and Sammy songs on it. And this on that one, Sammy's come back in and done some new songs. So yeah, and of course, I don't think they'd really bother if they did a Best of with the Gary Sharon songs. I wouldn't think, but you never know. But yeah, hey, maybe it will. Volume 2 will come out at some point. But yeah, so there's that. Now this is a little bit obscure and probably not the type of music maybe that I feature much on this channel. It's the kind of music I do like though. This is a band called Like a Storm. They're actually a New Zealand band, but they are internationally quite well known. They've toured with bands like Alter Bridge, Godsmack, bands like that, sort of modern rock. This came out in 2014. I think it was mainly released here in New Zealand, and they are a New Zealand band, but they're based in the States, I think, most of the time, or overseas anyway. But this was given a bit of a release here in New Zealand, and I don't think anywhere else. Most of the songs on here then were put on the album that came out after this. But it's called Chaos Theory Part 1, and there has not been a follow-up to this. So there's no Chaos Theory Part 2 that I know of anyway. Yeah, so there's an example of that. But like I say, they then did carry on and release albums after this, and I guess that maybe just not bothering. I think perhaps the idea may have been to Part 2 was going to be the other set of songs that they ended up just putting into the next album. Next one, White Zombie. So this has got a hugely, quite a long title. Actually, the next album's got even a longer title. This is, and I probably can't even pronounce it, but it's basically Devil Music Volume 1. I'll just shorten it and just say it's Devil Music Volume 1. There was no Volume 2. Of course, White Zombie, they released another album after this one. Yeah, this is the one with a really long song title. Songs of Love, Destruction, and Other Synthetic Delusions of the Electric Head. So that was the next album. Yeah, so maybe they thought at some point, oh, we'll do the Devil's Music Volume 2 later on. Maybe they were going to get around to that some other time. Of course, what ends up happening is Rob Zombie goes solo after this album. And he actually puts out Hillbilly Deluxe. Interestingly enough, there's a Hillbilly Deluxe Part 2, but there's no Part 1 written on there, so there was never any necessarily intention for there to be a Part 2. So I'm only really focusing on where they have put Part 1 or Volume 1, with they've had that intention right from the start that perhaps there's going to be a Volume 1 or Part 1 or Part 2. So yeah, there is a Part 2 of this, but yeah, as I say, it wasn't specified on here. And yeah, and that's pretty much it from albums I've got in my collection that have either Part 1 or Volume 1 written in the title, and then there hasn't been. Now, I know there's lots of albums that have Part 1 or Volume 1, and then, but then they actually have followed through and had a Part 2 or Volume 2. Let me know if you can think of any other ones. Oh, there is one more, actually. I don't have it. That doesn't have a Part 2, and that was Limp Bizkit and the Unquestionable Truth. I don't mind Limp Bizkit, but yeah, don't have that one. But that was like an EP, and yeah, Unquestionable Truth Part 1. Haven't seen Part 2. But so that's one example. But yeah, can you think of any other ones where there's been like a title, it's had Part 1 or Volume 1 after it, and then it never ended up being released or coming out, or maybe it's still to come, who knows. All right, so yeah, mainly a focus on Warrant, but just some other things as well that fit the theme. I hope you enjoyed that. Make sure you hit that like button, hit the subscribe if you haven't already. Leave some comments. Yeah, always love to hear from people. All right, we'll catch you later. See ya.